Unit 1, Presentation 2, The History of Parole. When I first started working on supporting people with parole hearing preparation and reading up on parole, it struck me that it really is a multifaceted institution. This is the first in a group of presentations which looks at 8 of those facets: history, philosophy, politics, law, storytelling, re-entry, agency, and forgiveness. You can't really start the history of parole with the history of parole. Instead, you have to think about the history of incarceration. When we think of punishment for criminal offending, prison springs instantly to mind. It is, however, only in more recent times that prison has been the central mechanism for punishing people. Until the 1800s, most punishment was not measured in time, but was carried out directly on the body. Physical punishment ranged from the death penalty through various gruesome mechanisms for inflicting pain and injury to ingenious methods for making people feel shame. These methods represented the core of what it meant to punish someone. Prison, to the extent that it was used, tended to be for pre-trial detention or for people who hadn't committed crimes but instead were unable to pay off their debts. The word parole comes from the French parole, which means word but can also mean promise, and relates to the phrase parole d'honneur, namely word of honour. It became associated centuries ago with the release of prisoners who had given their word, an example being prisoners of war who had given their word that they would not start fighting again. Our modern concept of parole, the early release of an inmate upon certain conditions, necessarily postdates the development of incarceration as a central mechanism for punishment. Modern-day parole is generally associated with the ideas of a British naval officer named Alexander Maconochie, who had innovative ideas about punishment. Alexander Maconochie was a penal reformer who was well ahead of his time and is sometimes referred to as the father of parole. He put his ideas into practice in 1840 when he was assigned as the warden of Norfolk Island, a remote Australian penal colony, and in 1849 as the warden of Birmingham Prison in England. The centrepiece of his thinking was a mark system. Essentially, the idea was a person could secure his own release through his own moral endeavour. Maconochie was driven by a belief in the inherent dignity of humans. He served in the Napoleonic Wars and spent 2 miserable years as a prisoner of war. Maconochie saw that a system which is fixated on punishment turns people out crushed and bitter. He was innovative in firmly believing that the focus of punishment ought to be rehabilitation rather than retribution. He believed that many failures in the area of punishment could be put down to attempts to punish and rehabilitate simultaneously. The idea was that you can't beat a man down and raise him up at the same time. Instead, at the beginning of a sentence, he suggested a short but severe punishment phase, which related to the wrong done in the past. He felt that thereafter the focus of punishment should be forward-looking, that is, it should be aimed at reforming and raising the person up. Maconochie believed that prison should be task rather than time-focused. Consequently, under his model, there was no upper limit to the length of a person's sentence. Instead, an inmate was able, through his own moral endeavour, to earn his way out. Maconochie therefore devised his mark system, marks being points a person could earn or have deducted according to his behaviour. It was that system which is a precursor to our modern-day concept of parole. As I shall discuss in further presentations, there are ways in which our modern-day parole systems aren't really true to the spirit of Maconochie, and in particular his point that it doesn't make sense to try to crush people and raise them up at the same time.